All right, welcome back, everyone, for part 2 of our deep dive into modern Indian history. I know this is really important for our UPSC aspirants and really anyone interested in this pivotal period. So we talked last time about the early 20th century in India.
Right, setting the stage.
Yeah, setting the stage. And now we're going to build on that foundation and really try to understand the rise of these leftist movements in India, specifically the Congress Socialist Party and the Communist Party of India.
Yeah, and these movements are really key. They weren't just historical footnotes. They had a major impact on India's journey to independence, and they continue to play a key role in shaping the country's political and social fabric even after 1947.
Yeah, absolutely. And so really crucial for anyone studying modern Indian history for UPSC or just for fun.
Absolutely.
Now let's start with the Congress Socialist Party, or CSP.
Okay.
They emerged in a really interesting way, almost like a shop within a shop, right? Forming within the Indian National Congress in May of 1934.
Yeah, that's right. And this is a point that often trips people up. They weren't a completely separate party. They were a group within Congress. Almost like a caucus or a faction who believed that the party needed to adopt a more radical and socialist approach.
So almost trying to steer it in a different direction, more towards socialism. What were their main goals? What did this socialist approach actually look like?
Well, their brand of socialism was really interesting. They called it decentralized socialism, and it emphasized empowering local communities and grassroots organizations. So think cooperatives, trade unions, village councils, and panchayats.
So not necessarily advocating for that top-down, state-controlled kind of socialism, much more about empowering people at the local level.
Exactly.
Were there specific reasons why they emphasized this decentralized approach?
Well, there were a few reasons. First, they were deeply critical of what they saw as the exploitative nature of both British colonialism and the existing feudal structures within India. So they believed that true economic and social justice couldn't be achieved simply by transferring power from the British to a centralized Indian government.
So it wasn't enough to just change who's in charge.
Exactly. They wanted a more fundamental transformation of society. And second, they drew inspiration from Gandhian ideas of self-sufficiency and village-level economic development.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, so they saw decentralized socialism as a way to build a more equitable and just society from the ground up.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
So blending socialist and Gandhian principles.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that the CSP was formed within Congress. Did they face any pushback from within the party? Were people happy about this?
Oh, absolutely. They created quite a stir. They were challenging the existing power structures and advocating for policies that many in Congress saw as too radical.
Like what kind of policies? What were they actually trying to push for?
Well, imagine them pressuring local Congress leaders to implement things like canceling peasant debts, redistributing land, giving workers more control over their workplaces.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that might have ruffled some feathers.
Yeah.
So we've got this tension then between this leftist faction represented by the CSP and the more moderate or even right-leaning factions within Congress.
Exactly. And it really highlights a key dynamic of Indian politics at the time. Congress was this broad umbrella organization that encompassed this wide spectrum of ideologies.
It had to be right to try to get everybody on board with the idea of independence.
Yeah, and so you had those who favored a more gradual evolutionary approach to social change, and then you had the CSP pushing for more radical and immediate action.
Yeah, trying to pull it to the left.
Exactly.
And we can't forget that they had some support from prominent figures outside the CSP as well.
That's right. Jawaharlal Nehru, who would later become India's first prime minister, and Subhas Chandra Bose, a very charismatic leader who had a more radical nationalist stance. Both of them leaned towards socialist ideals and often found common ground with the CSP's agenda.
Yeah, so the influence extended beyond just their own membership.
Absolutely.
It's interesting to see these different strands of thought interacting. Now, while the CSP was trying to steer Congress from within, another player emerged on the scene, the Communist Party of India, or CPI.
Right.
And their story unfolded in a very different way.
Yes. The CPI's journey is fascinating and complex, I think. To really grasp their significance, we need to break down their evolution into 5 distinct phases.
Okay, I like it. 5 phases. So let's start with phase 1. Where did it all begin for the CPI?
So the first phase, spanning from the late 1920s to the early 1930s, was a period of immense challenge for this nascent CPI. They faced a very hostile British Raj that viewed communism as a direct threat to its authority.
This is where we see that infamous Meerut conspiracy case.
Precisely. In 1929, several prominent CPI leaders were arrested and charged with sedition, essentially accused of inciting rebellion against the British Crown, and the trial dragged on for years.
Wow.
And this really cast a shadow over the early CPI, building a solid organizational structure while evading colonial surveillance and repression that became their primary challenge.
Yeah, operating under immense pressure, constantly looking over their shoulder. But after such a dramatic trial, things seemed to quiet down a bit. What happened? Why did the CPI become less active in the mid-1930s?
That's a great question. And it leads us to the second phase of their journey, the political wilderness. The Meerut trial had a chilling effect. The CPI faced internal conflicts, and the constant threat of arrest and imprisonment forced them to adopt a more subdued approach.
So not that they disappeared entirely,
No.
they just had to operate more discreetly.
Exactly. Think of it as a period of strategic retreat and reassessment. They had to adapt to the harsh realities of operating under a repressive colonial regime.
It makes you wonder how you sustain a movement when you're constantly facing that pressure. But they did persevere because they reemerged in the mid-1930s.
Yes, they did, and this reemergence marks the beginning of their third phase. The mid-1930s saw a strategic shift in the CPI's approach. They began to see the fight against British colonialism as part of a broader global struggle against imperialism.
So they're connecting their local struggle to this larger international context.
Precisely. They recognized that to effectively challenge British rule, they needed to build alliances with other anti-imperialist forces, both within India and on the world stage.
Okay.
This led them to attempt to collaborate with other nationalist movements and to seek common ground with groups fighting for independence in other colonized nations.
So moving away from a purely confrontational approach and exploring the potential of strategic alliances, did this shift towards collaboration lead to any friction or disagreements?
Of course, building alliances is never easy, especially when dealing with groups that have different ideologies and priorities. The CPI's attempts to collaborate with Congress, for example, were marked by both periods of unity and moments of tension.
I can imagine Congress, as we've already discussed, was this diverse group
Right.
with a range of viewpoints.
Exactly.
Were there specific issues that caused friction between them?
Yes. One key point of contention was the ultimate goal of the freedom struggle. The CPI envisioned a socialist republic for an independent India, while many within Congress, particularly those from the more moderate or right-leaning factions, favored a more capitalist-oriented model.
So the debate about what kind of society independent India should become was already brewing.
Absolutely. These were fundamental questions about the very nature of the nation they were fighting to create.
And then World War II explodes onto the scene, throwing everything into chaos. How did this global conflict impact the CPI's trajectory?
This is where we encounter one of the most controversial chapters in the CPI's history, what's often referred to as the wartime somersault.
Okay, the somersault. What happened?
Well, initially the CPI opposed World War II, viewing it as an imperialist conflict driven by capitalist powers vying for global dominance.
Which makes sense given their anti-imperialist stance.
Right, but you called it a somersault, so I'm guessing their position changed.
Yeah.
Yes, quite dramatically. In 1941, when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the CPI, aligning itself with the USSR's communist ideology, suddenly shifted its stance and began supporting the Allied war effort.
Wow, a complete reversal.
Yeah.
I imagine this about-face didn't go over well with everyone.
You're right. This sudden shift drew sharp criticism from various quarters. Many accused the CPI of betraying their anti-imperialist principles and prioritizing international communist solidarity over India's own interests.
It must have been a deeply divisive moment.
It was.
Both within the CPI and within the broader Indian nationalist movement. It really highlights the dilemmas faced by these movements, trying to balance those ideological commitments with the complex realities of global politics.
Exactly. And it sets the stage for the final phase of the CPI's journey before independence, which is marked by their participation in the transfer of power negotiations and their advocacy for a very unique and somewhat controversial plan for independent India.
This must be what you were referring to earlier, the multinational plan.
Yes.
Tell me more about that. What did it entail?
The multinational plan reflected the CPI's attempt to grapple with the immense diversity of India. They argued that a truly just and equitable nation had to recognize and respect the rights of all communities, particularly minorities, who they felt were often marginalized within the existing power structures.
Okay, so they're acknowledging that social divisions go beyond class.
Right.
That a one-size-fits-all approach wouldn't work in the Indian context.
Precisely. And their proposed solution was a federal structure for independent India that granted a significant degree of autonomy to different regions and communities, a structure that went far beyond what most other political actors were advocating at the time.
It sounds like a radical idea and probably sparked quite a bit of debate. But before we delve into the reactions to the CPI's multinational plan, let's shift our focus back to the Congress Socialist Party. We left them navigating the choppy waters of internal Congress politics. What were their key contributions to the freedom struggle, and what happened to them once India achieved independence?
The CSP played a vital role in pushing for a more socially just and equitable vision of independent India. Their activism went beyond simply advocating for political freedom from British rule. They were deeply committed to dismantling what they saw as the exploitative economic structures that kept millions of Indians trapped in poverty and oppression.
So fighting a two-pronged battle against colonialism and against social injustice. What specific actions did they take to address these issues?
Well, we've already touched upon their efforts to pressure Congress to implement land reforms, provide debt relief for peasants, and regulate or eliminate exploitative middlemen in agricultural systems. But their work went beyond just policy advocacy. They were actively involved in organizing labor unions, promoting the idea of cooperatives as a means of economic empowerment, and advocating for the rights of workers and marginalized communities.
So trying to build a movement from the ground up, empowering ordinary people to challenge the status quo. And they had some powerful allies, right?
Yeah.
Didn't we mention earlier that both Nehru and Bose were sympathetic to their cause?
Yes, both Nehru and Bose, although not members of the CSP themselves, were drawn to socialist ideals and often found common ground with the CSP's vision for a more just and equitable India. In fact, Nehru's own socialist leanings would later influence his policies as India's first prime minister.
It's fascinating to see how these different strands of socialist thought were intertwining and shaping the political landscape in the lead up to independence. But here's the big question. What happened to the CSP after independence? Did they just fade into the background?
That's a crucial question, and it reveals a lot about the challenges socialist movements faced in post-independence India. You see, with Congress, now led by Nehru, adopting a more socialist-oriented agenda, the need for a distinct socialist group within the party diminished.
So it's almost like their mission had been partially accomplished.
In a way, yes. But it also created a dilemma for the CSP. They had to decide whether to continue as a separate entity within Congress, potentially risking internal conflict, or to dissolve and allow their members to pursue their goals in different ways.
So what did they ultimately decide to do?
Ultimately, the CSP chose to dissolve in 1948. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but rather a gradual process of members choosing different paths. Some remained within Congress, hoping to influence policy from within. Others joined other leftist groups like the CPI or newly emerging socialist parties. And some even went on to form their own distinct socialist organizations, carrying forward the CSP's legacy in different ways.
So not a neat and tidy ending, more of a splintering,
Right.
a scattering of seeds that would take root in different parts of the political landscape.
Exactly. The CSP's dissolution wasn't necessarily a failure, but rather a reflection of the evolving political realities of independent India. Their ideas had seeped into the mainstream, influencing the policies of the ruling Congress Party. But it also meant they had to adapt and find new ways to push for their vision of a truly socialist India.
That's a really important point. It highlights the dynamic nature of political movements. They evolve, adapt, sometimes even disappear, but their legacy can continue to shape the course of history. But for now, let's return to the CPI. We left them at the negotiating table fighting for their multinational plan as independence approached. I'm really curious to hear more about the specifics of this plan and how it fit into their broader ideology.
The CPI's multinational plan was a unique and, as you mentioned, somewhat controversial proposal. It reflected their commitment to addressing India's immense diversity, a diversity that went far beyond just class differences. They recognized that religion, caste, language, ethnicity, and regional identities all played a powerful role in shaping people's lives and experiences.
So they're acknowledging that a purely class-based approach to revolution, which is often associated with traditional Marxist thought, wouldn't fully capture the complexities of the Indian context.
Exactly. And that's where the multinational plan comes in. They envisioned a federal structure for independent India that granted a significant degree of autonomy to different regions and communities, almost to the point of allowing them to function as semi-autonomous entities within the larger Indian Union. They even went so far as to suggest that these nationalities, based on language, culture, or ethnicity, should have the right to self-determination, including the option to secede from India if they so desired.
Wow, giving each region the option to leave the Union altogether. I can only imagine how controversial that must have been.
It certainly was, and we'll delve into the reactions to this plan and its broader implications in our next segment. But for now, I think it's important to understand that the CPI was grappling with fundamental questions about how to build a truly inclusive and equitable nation in a context of such immense diversity.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How do you balance the need for unity with the need to respect and accommodate difference? These are questions that continue to resonate in Indian politics even today.
Yeah.
But we'll have to pause our exploration there for now.
It's fascinating how these debates from the 1940s still resonate today. The CPI's multinational plan, with its emphasis on regional autonomy and self-determination, really pushed the boundaries of what people thought was possible.
It definitely challenges the idea of just a monolithic, centralized nation state, doesn't it?
It does.
Forces us to think about how you balance unity with diversity, a question that, as you said, is still very much alive in Indian politics.
Right.
But let's go back to the reactions to this plan. How did other political actors respond to the CPR's proposal?
Well, as you might imagine, it was met with a mixed bag of reactions. Some, particularly those from minority communities who felt marginalized within the existing power structures, were quite receptive to the idea. They saw it as a potential safeguard against what they feared might be majoritarian domination in a newly independent India.
It makes sense that groups who felt their voices weren't being heard would be drawn to a plan that promised greater autonomy,
Right.
self-determination.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing not everyone was on board.
You're absolutely right. Many within Congress, even those who were sympathetic to socialist ideals, saw the multinational plan as a threat to national unity. They worried that such a decentralized structure would lead to fragmentation and potentially even the breakup of India.
So almost like two competing visions for independent India emerging here.
Yeah.
One championed by the CPI, emphasizing diversity, regional autonomy.
Right.
The other favored by many in Congress, prioritizing a more centralized and unified nation state.
Exactly. And this clash of visions played out in the debates surrounding the drafting of India's constitution and the structuring of its political system in those crucial years after independence.
And even today.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how these debates from the 1940s continue to shape discussions about federalism, state rights, and the balance of power between the central government and the states, even today.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds us that history isn't just a collection of dusty old facts. It's a living, breathing narrative that continues to shape the present.
Right.
Speaking of which, let's bring our focus back to the UPSC perspective for a moment.
Yeah.
Why is understanding these leftist movements, both the CSP and the CPI, so crucial for aspiring civil servants?
Well, their legacies are woven into the very fabric of modern India. Their ideas, their struggles, and the debates they sparked have profoundly influenced India's political discourse, social policies, and economic trajectory. So to understand India today, to grasp its challenges and opportunities, you need to understand the historical forces that have shaped it.
So it's not just about memorizing dates and names for the exam.
Not at all.
Right.
It's about understanding the underlying currents of thought, the clash of ideologies, the social and economic realities that have shaped India's journey.
Right.
And for those aiming to serve in the Indian civil service, this historical understanding is essential.
It's like having a roadmap
Yeah.
that helps you navigate the present.
Precisely. And these leftist movements provide key insights into how India grappled with fundamental questions about social justice, economic equality, political power, and the very nature of the nation itself.
Right.
These are themes that continue to be relevant for anyone involved in shaping India's future.
Couldn't have put it better myself. But let's not lose sight of the CSP. We've been focusing a lot on the CPI's multinational plan and its implications. What about the CSP's vision for post-independence India? Do they have a specific plan or set of policies they advocated for?
While the CSP didn't have a formal detailed plan like the CPI's multinational plan, their vision for independent India was deeply rooted in their commitment to decentralized socialism and grassroots empowerment. Remember their emphasis on cooperatives, trade unions, and village-level economic development.
Yeah.
They saw these as the building blocks of a more just and equitable society.
So rather than focusing on capturing state power and implementing sweeping top-down reforms, they were more interested in empowering people at the local level to create change from the ground up.
Yes, and this approach was influenced by a combination of socialist ideals and Gandhian principles of self-reliance and village-level development. They believed that true social transformation had to come from the people themselves, not from a distant and potentially bureaucratic central government.
Okay.
They wanted to create a society where ordinary people had a real voice in shaping their own lives and communities.
It's a vision that's both idealistic and pragmatic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Idealistic in its commitment to social justice and equality, but pragmatic in its focus on grassroots action and community-driven solutions.
Right.
It makes you wonder how their approach might have played out on a larger scale if they had been in a position to implement it more widely.
It's certainly an interesting thought experiment, but it's important to remember that the CSP, like all political movements, operated within the constraints of their time and context. They faced numerous challenges, both internal and external, and their influence, while significant, was ultimately limited.
You've mentioned several times that both the CSP and the CPI faced challenges. Could you elaborate on what some of those challenges were? What factors hindered their ability to achieve their goals more fully?
Well, for both movements, the repressive policies of the British Raj were a constant obstacle. Remember the Meerut conspiracy case and the other measures taken to suppress communist and socialist activities.
Right.
These actions made it incredibly difficult for them to organize, openly build a mass base, and spread their message effectively. They were constantly under surveillance, facing the threat of arrest and imprisonment. It's a testament to their resilience and dedication that they were able to persevere at all.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
To maintain a movement under such intense pressure. It speaks to the power of their ideas and their commitment to their cause.
Absolutely. But even after independence, the challenges didn't disappear. Both movements faced internal divisions and ideological debates about the best path forward. The CSP, as we discussed, ultimately dissolved as a distinct entity with its members scattering to different parts of the political spectrum. And the CPI, despite its significant role in the freedom struggle, struggled to gain widespread electoral success in the decades following independence.
So even though they played a crucial role in shaping India's journey to independence and influenced its political landscape in profound ways, they never quite achieved the level of political dominance they may have aspired to.
That's right. But I think it's important to remember that political influence isn't always measured by electoral success or the ability to implement a specific set of policies. Sometimes it's about shifting the Overton window, introducing new ideas into the public discourse, and inspiring generations of activists and thinkers. And in that sense, I think it's fair to say that both the CSP and the CPI left an indelible mark on India.
It's a good reminder that historical impact can take many forms, isn't it? It's not always about who wins the elections or holds the reins of power. Sometimes it's about the ideas that take root and the long-term transformations they set in motion.
Exactly. And that brings us to an intriguing question. How might India's post-independence trajectory have been different if either the CSP or the CPI had achieved greater political dominance? Would they have succeeded in creating their envisioned socialist utopias? Or would they have faced even greater challenges in navigating the complexities of a vast and diverse nation grappling with the legacies of colonialism, poverty, and social inequality?
That's a fascinating question to ponder.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about the possibilities, the limitations of political movements, and the unpredictable nature of history itself. But we'll have to leave that question hanging for now as we've reached the end of our deep dive into the history of India's leftist movements. Welcome back, everyone. I feel like we've covered so much ground already, and yet we've only just scratched the surface
We have.
of these fascinating movements. It's amazing how relevant their ideas and struggles still feel today.
I completely agree. They weren't just movements confined to a particular moment in history.
Right.
Their legacies continue to shape India's political and social landscape in profound ways.
Yeah, and speaking of legacies before the break, we were discussing that kind of tantalizing what if.
Right.
What if the CSP or CPI had achieved greater political dominance in independent India?
Right. Would they have been able to fully realize their socialist visions?
Right.
Would India have taken a more radical path, perhaps resembling some other socialist states that emerged in the 20th century? Or would they have faced insurmountable challenges given India's unique complexities and the global political climate of the Cold War era?
So many possibilities, and it's so tempting to get lost in those alternative histories.
It is.
But for our listeners who are focused on the real-world implications, especially those preparing for the UPSC exam, let's bring it back to the concrete impacts of these movements.
Absolutely. Even though neither the CSP nor the CPI ever achieved outright political dominance, their influence on India's post-independence development is undeniable. Think about the policies implemented in those early decades, the emphasis on social justice, the commitment to building a strong public sector, the focus on reducing poverty and inequality, and the recognition of India's linguistic and cultural diversity.
It's almost like they planted the seeds
Yeah.
for a more inclusive and equitable society, even if they weren't always the ones to reap the harvest.
That's a great way to put it. Their ideas seeped into the mainstream, influencing policymakers, intellectuals, and activists across the political spectrum, and their struggles helped to create a space for dissent, for challenging the status quo, and for demanding a more just and equitable society. These were crucial contributions, even if they didn't always translate into immediate political power.
Right, and that point about creating a space for dissent is so important.
It
They
is.
weren't just advocating for specific policy.
Oh,
They were helping to shape the very culture of democracy in India, encouraging people to participate in the political process and to hold their leaders accountable. That's a legacy that goes far beyond any particular ideology or political program.
I couldn't agree more. And their impact went beyond the realm of politics. They played a vital role in shaping India's intellectual landscape, fostering critical thinking and challenging traditional hierarchies. They encouraged people to question assumptions, to analyze power structures, and to imagine alternative futures. This kind of intellectual ferment is essential for any society that aspires to be truly democratic and progressive.
Yeah, it's inspiring to think about how a relatively small group of individuals, often operating under incredibly difficult circumstances, could have such a profound impact. It's a testament to the power of ideas, commitment, and persistent struggle.
Absolutely. And their stories remind us that history is made not only by those in positions of power, but also by those who dare to challenge the status quo, to imagine a better world and to fight for it, even when the odds seem stacked against them.
Those are words to live by, and a perfect note to end on. I think for all our listeners, especially our dedicated UPSC aspirants, remember that mastering this history is not just about memorizing facts and dates. It's about understanding the complexities of India's journey, the forces that have shaped its present, and the legacies that continue to influence its future.
I would add that studying these movements with all their internal debates and strategic shifts can also help you to develop those critical thinking skills and those analytical frameworks that are so crucial for success in the UPSC exam. So delve deep, explore widely, and don't be afraid to ask those tough questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And remember, history isn't just a subject to be studied. It's a living narrative that we're all a part of. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the past to better understand the present and shape the future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more explorations of history, politics, and everything in between.